adrenaline junkie, addicted to violence. Probably spends every day of his life looking for the big thrill, the big rush. Carving up a guy like that while he screams in his own blood and excrement, well, that would be like a gift. Warrior's death. Hell, you'd probably get off on it.
Crank 1 and 2 are my favorite action movies by far, and because I saw them at a young age, they have become my benchmark for every other movie of that genre. I know that this is not only nostalgia. Crank has a fanatical fanbase that keeps asking for the third installment. And those are not just some weirdos in the YouTube comments. Among the fans of Crank are real heavyweights like Quentin Tarantino and Edgar Wright. So there is definitely something about Crank that makes it good, if only in the eyes of a few. Now, for weird action movies like Crank, you won't find elaborate video essays as what makes these movies great, and that is understandable. Crank does not take itself seriously at all, so to look for some sort of message or deeper meaning might not seem very promising. But I couldn't help but feel like there is something that elevates these movies above most others. There have to be reasons why they work so well, why they are so revered. So this video is my attempt to explain why you love Crank. Crank has a very likable main character, and one it is easy to identify with. This might seem weird, as Chev Chelios is a criminal and an assassin, but it becomes easier to understand when he is compared to another fictional and well-liked character, who is, ironically, part of the Disney universe. He goes by the name of Donald Duck. Why Donald Duck is so likable and easy to identify oneself with is because of all the bad luck that he experiences. This is very much also true for Chev Chelios. He goes through a lot. It is apparent that the directors had fun seeing him in painful or embarrassing situations, such as when Chev gets shot in the butt, when he has to rub himself against people in public, when he crashes his car, or when he has to wear hospital clothing. Chev Chelios is a prime example of a butt monkey, and we as the audience enjoy his suffering as well. Now compare this to Donald Duck. Would his adventures be as fun if he were not constantly confronted with adversity? Like Chelios, he faces endless amounts of bad luck. And like Chelios, his reaction is not acceptance or resignation or sorrow even, but rage. This is the second major similarity between these two figures that is seemingly so removed. Their major weakness. Chelios is, like Donald Duck, very irritable, and while it is a characteristic that guarantees his survival sometimes, Chelios is evidently much more efficient when he's calm and calculated. The movie makes it quite clear that rage is a tool that has its merits, but more often than not results in self-destruction. This is demonstrated at the end of both movies, when Chelios' final outbursts lead to his own downfall. Again, and like with Donald Duck, the negative consequences of rage are used for comedic effect. At the same time, they have us rooting for him as we partake in his suffering and the resulting anger, making any sort of success very satisfying. As more bad stuff happens to Chev, the more we look forward to his success. However, we can only root for them because both Chev Chelios and Donald Duck have reasonable motives. Despite their bad temper, they are fundamentally good-hearted. While Chev Chelios just wants to survive the poison in Crank 1, he has an even more concrete and reasonable goal in Crank 2, when he is literally looking for his heart. Chev Chelios is also surprisingly reactive and not unnecessarily violent. Most of the time he only attacks those who have been attacking him. In fact, the only time we see him in his job as an assassin, he spares the victim, leading to the very storyline of Crank 1. The victim of this assassination eventually rescues him, and this is not the only case where Chev Chelios' good actions result in him profiting from it later in the story. Another such instance is the Chinese girl in Crank 2, whom he incidentally saves from prostitution, and who goes on to save him when he's captured by El Huron. In another scene, the dog that he saves repays him by taking a bite out of his pursuers. This is of course quite literally a case of the trope of petting the dog, but it serves a point. That point being that Chev Chelios is a good guy stuck in a bad guy's world, which is of course a great setup, whether it is in action, sci-fi or video games. Baby Driver also takes this approach, and so does John Wick. You might not believe me when I say that Chev Chelios is not overly violent, but it stands out when he is. For instance, he once drives over a guy in the beginning of Crank 1. This is one of only 2 scenes where Chelios hurts or even kills an innocent person for no reason. He normally pacifies them, but he's professional about it and does not cause unnecessary harm. The only times when civilians or policemen are injured is when his life depends on it. As a matter of fact, even his body count of goons is not very high. It's only about 11 in Crank 1 and 22 in Crank 2, which is modest compared to other action movies. All of this is not to say that Chev Chelios is not meant to be a warrior figure. This is clearly stated in Crank 1 when the reasoning behind the poisoning is laid out in a hallucination.
The big rush, carving up a guy like that while he screams in his own blood and excrement, well, that would be like a gift. Warrior's death. Hell, you'd probably get off on it.
So Chelios is clearly good at killing, but that does not mean that he was born to do this. This is also made quite clear in the talk show sequence in Crank 2, where he is presented as the product of a fatherless upbringing with a clueless mother figure. For all we know, Chelios might not even have wanted to become a killer, but we can be sure of his desire to stop killing and survive, making him likable, despite his current way of life. At this point, the comparison to Donald Duck seems to have become quite far-fetched, but again, the way that both characters are shown to be fundamentally good and lovable is similar. While Donald Duck overcomes, or at least attempts to overcome, his weaknesses for the love of his life, Chev Chelios shows his very best side for his girlfriend, Eve. Eve, played by Amy Smart, is actually one of the most criticized aspects of Crank. Many find her to be portrayed as a mere sex object, and as very basic, but I would argue that the way she's portrayed is very important for the story of Crank. For one, of course, she saves the life of Chev twice, but that is not what I mean. For Chev and for us, she symbolizes innocence and obliviousness, but most of all, a life of peace and happiness. If Chev Chelios is a classic warrior figure, then Eve is what he's fighting for. For him, Eve is not bankrupted, but the underworld that Chelios is living in. She's what is waiting for him at the exit, and when she wanders off into Chelios' world, she's not rescued by him, but endangered, only to come to his rescue when he, quite literally, runs out of steam. Eve is the ultimate goal and motivation for Chelios, and this is made very clear at the end of Crank 2, in this overly cheesy scene. Eve takes a very similar role to Deborah in Baby Driver, but I would argue that Crank uses this trope of a paradise girl in a more interesting way. As opposed to Deborah, who is portrayed as virtually flawless, Eve is not princess-like at all. That is only how Chelios wants to see her. Eve is a stoner, chaotic, naive, crude, and ready to work in a strip club. And while Chev does attempt to rescue her, we could argue that she does not really need rescuing. By the looks of it, she's perfectly content with her life. She's the one that has to help Chev out repeatedly. And weirdly enough, this is also very similar to the Daisy-Donald dynamic. His romantic imagination is constantly contrasted with the imperfections of their environment and themselves, making their relationship likable and humorous. We should of course not forget that for most of Crank 1 and 2, there is no realistic chance for such a happy ending. And Chev Chelios knows this. Chelios is well aware that he's going to die, so his most long-term goal, at least in Crank 1, is not to live with Eve, and not even to survive. Chev Chelios wants to go down fighting. This is the first thing that comes to his mind as he watches Ricky Verona's DVD, and this sentiment does not leave him until he snaps Verona's neck, while falling to his own supposed death. This is the motto of the movie. The very same sentiment reappears in Crank 2 after he witnesses his heart being removed and the triads planning his evisceration. Chev Chelios does not want to go gentle into the night. His mind is set on taking those responsible down with him. As soon as he knows about the nature of the poison in Crank 1, he could accept his defeat and die in a quiet place, as a goon suggests later on, but he decides to hunt Verona down. This motif is so essential to the story of Crank that it is even elaborated upon by Verona in a hallucination. According to this scene, Chelios is about to attempt exactly what Verona wanted to deny him, a warrior's death, the satisfaction of going down fighting. Ironically, and most likely coincidentally, Chev Chelios literally goes down fighting over downtown LA. This is of course the moment where he succeeds, and he accepts his fate, only to be forced to keep on going in Crank 2. Now, Crank 2 also uses this sentiment, and Chev Chelios does, again, go down fighting, but it is not as guiding as it was in Crank 1. Chelios' hot-headed pursuit of the box is of course also an example of him being guided by rage. He goes about finding it like in the first film, and acts too rashly in the process, similar to a certain cartoon character. The result is unfortunate and as such surprisingly realistic, which actually can be said for Crank as a whole. Realism is something that is not normally associated with Crank. In fact, Crank is famous for allegedly being completely over the top and unrealistic. And while it is true that there are a handful of very unlikely moments, realism is one of Crank's defining features and its final ticket to greatness. Hear me out. While most other action movies avoid near impossible scenarios like this one, in order to stay believable, they do have a very high frequency of unlikely scenarios. Take John Wick for example. None of his kills are impossible by themselves, but all of them together are very unlikely. Compare this to Crank. The way the poison works seems inconvenient and the artificial heart seems a bit powerful, but as we are not physicians, we are inclined to suspend disbelief here. When Chelios goes up against enemies, he's not overly powerful, his aim is not perfect, and he gets hurt quite a bit. One wound even has delayed effects. Then there are of course those parts that are either objectively unlikely or that seem to be impossible from our perspective. And there are very striking ones, the most prominent one being Chelios falling from a helicopter and surviving. However, here the movies make sure that such obvious abnormalities are treated as such by the characters. This does not only add to the humor of Crank, but also keeps the setting grounded and plausible, by making the viewer just another baffled witness. A good example of this is the scene where Chelios grabs a power distributor and is questioned by a quite astonished passerby. A lesser movie would, at this point in the story, just ignore the abnormality of this action, but Crank does not. Crank even attempts to maintain a thread of plausibility by including speculative explanations for some of the abnormalities.
Parachute doesn't open and he falls like 14,000 feet and he lives!
Yes, baby, I know it's possible because I fucking did it!
Crank creates realism by showing plausible reactions and consequences in the environment of Chelios, making the entire story more grounded to the world we know. Consider the reporters reacting to the events, the triad that is taken care of by an ambulance, or the therapy scene in Crank 2. It may only be the setup for a cruel joke, but I'm not aware of any other action movie that depicts the psychological effects of violence on innocent people. All of this combined makes us accept the absurd moments of Crank, because they are absurd in the world of Crank as well. And as the world of Crank itself is entirely plausible, we are never taken out of the experience. To the contrary, we cheer for Chelios because he is evidently a good guy, on a string of bad luck, with unrealistic aims, in a world that is so understandable to us, but also feared. Only his physical abilities separate him from us, and a certain duck character. There are many more things that let these movies stand out from the rest, but I hope that those presented here gave you a new perspective on Crank. The cinematography and style alone would fill another whole video, and the use of practical effects and the soundtrack are also worth discussing, but that is for another time. So I thank you for watching, and urge you to keep on nagging Jason Statham and the others about Crank 3.
So let me